If it was me, if ever I get isekai in a world like this, I'd probably just resign from existence. I'm out. I'm done. Alright class, settle down and let me tell you a story. For tonight, we have some Warhammer 40K horror about being the worst thing you can be in a grimdark universe, which is being a normal person. Before we check it out, please like, share, subscribe, do the whole notification button thing to help me out with the algo, and here we go. Consumed by the Hive by the grimdark historian.
The Hive city of Territus Primus reared its blackened spires into the ashen sky.
Of course.
A mass of teeming humanity and decay piled upon itself over millennia. Its foundations were ancient. So
there's horror by itself. Remember, shit flows downhill.
Layered with grime and architectural overgrowth that the distinction between structure and filth had long since been lost. This was
I studied in a building in one of the oldest universities in Asia. And its main building I could best describe as it was Frankenstein because it had to make way for modern facilities such as plumbing, bathrooms, and computer laboratories where they needed to provide access wars for the access points for the LAN network. I mean, that's the best way we describe it.
Place where countless billions toiled endlessly for the God Emperor's greater glory. Or so the ecclesiarchy assured them. Gregor Tallow, a middling man of no note, counted himself among these multitudes.
That's it, the worst thing you can be in a grimdark universe, a regular person.
Neither gaunt nor corpulent, tall nor squat, he was a figure crafted perfectly to blend into the grey mundanity of the Hive. His drab work tunic bore the insignia of the administratum, the all-encompassing bureaucracy that stretched across the Imperium like a choking vine. Each day began the same. The blaring of the hab-level klaxon, a tinny, grating tone that stripped away dreams and left the listener with a faint headache as they shuffled to their duties.
Imagine getting isekai in this world. If it was me, if ever I get isekai in a world like this, I'd probably just resign from existence. I'm out. I'm done.
His mornings were marked by monotony. The air of his hab unit was laden with a coppery tang of recycled bread.
I mean, I guess compared to the others, he's quite lucky. He gets his own place. He gets to eat recycled bread, human starch.
And the dim lumen globes flickered spasmodically.
Lumen globe.
The previous tenant's devotional scrolls still clung to the walls, curling and yellowing with age. Yet Gregor lacked the initiative to remove them.
I mean, who would actually gain the initiative to actually clean this crap up if you're eating recycled bread?
They hung like sagging witnesses to the grind of his existence. The day's labor began with the automated
It seems like resignation from the existence is the only thing one can do in this particular universe.
A rusting, clattering vehicle packed with other drones like himself. Its corridors stank faintly of Promethean and unwashed bodies. Gregor stared into the middle distance as the vehicle jerked and groaned its way towards the data vaults.
Gregor's hot, you guys.
Not to think of the hours to come. The vaults themselves were catacombs of cogitators, their spindly arms hissing and clacking as they churned through reams of parchment data. Gregor's station was one among hundreds, a modest booth equipped with a fading lumen and a rickety chair. His task, as it had been for decades, was to cross-reference planetary tithe reports with supply records through reams of parchment data. Gregor's station was one among hundreds, a modest booth equipped with a fading lumen and a rickety chair.
It's
His
not that bad,
task, as it
actually.
had been for decades,
They made this study because you know what, modern media has been telling everyone that working on the booth or working inside the cubicle is like the worst thing that can happen to one's life. They actually did a study that the happiest people at present times, or at least Gen Xers, are those who work in cubicles day in day out, and their secret is weekend warrioring, meaning they basically live for the weekends. That's the key to their happiness. It's just a job. You clock out at 5 or 6 or something, and then live for whatever it is. Live for the weekend. Live for the nights. That's it.
was to cross-reference planetary tithe reports with supply requisitions. Entire generations of administrators had been lost to this drudgery, and Gregor often fancied that the ghosts of forgotten clerks hovered near, too weary even to haunt properly. 42 crates of lasgun power packs, he muttered to himself, his quill scratching out a correction in blocky Gothic script. Cross-filed under Sector 6. Emperor preserve me. The work was endless, a Sisyphean torment delivered with a whisper instead of a roar. Yet Gregor was not entirely without imagination. During the quieter moments, he would indulge himself in small fantasies of ascending to the spire levels, where the planetary elite dwelled in decadent splendor, or of being plucked from obscurity by the Arbites for some daring act of heroism.
Of course, everyone's entitled to their ambitions or to their delusions or fantasies, but I'm guessing this is how the gates to the horror will open, or this is how he's going to open the horrors, or to let the horrors in.
These dreams were, of course, absurd. It was during one such reverie that Gregor noticed the time. The lumen chronometer above his station blinked. 9:23. His shift had ended 3 minutes prior. It was a rare misstep. Gregor prided himself on punctuality, if nothing else. Hastily scrawling his
Why would you take pride in something like this?
signature on the day's tally sheet,
Well,
he packed
I guess if it's in the service of the Emperor, if you still had faith.
his belongings and joined the tide of workers leaving the vaults. The evening was as dismal as the day, the hive's atmosphere choked with fumes and the distant thrum of colossal machinery. Greg's route home took him through Hab District 43, a dilapidated quarter populated by the sullen and the destitute. The alleyways were narrow and labyrinthine, filled with shadows that seemed to writhe as if alive. He had always hurried through this district, head down and pace brisk, but tonight there was a peculiar air of
Glad to
disquiet.
see there are still no-go areas in this kind of universe.
A low chanting reached his ears as he turned a corner.
There we go.
It was faint at first.
All right. Bet $1,000 says he's going to sell his soul or something. He opened himself up to the horrors because of his ambition of being plucked for some special mission, or being a member of decadence.
Barely audible over the industrial din, but it grew steadily louder. The words were guttural, in a tongue that made his stomach churn to hear. He hesitated, half turning as if to retreat, but some inexplicable force compelled him forward. In a derelict square,
There we go,
beneath the
heresy!
shattered aquila that once stood in pious glory, a gathering of robed figures swayed in unison. Their robes were tattered, smeared with sigils that Gregor's eyes refused to fully comprehend. At their center, a crude effigy loomed, a mass.
At this point, I'm just glad there's no visuals of mutilated children or flesh. But guess what? We're only 5 minutes into the video, so we'll probably get there.
Of rusted scrap and bone, cobbled together into a horrific semblance of a many-eyed beast. Gregor froze, terror rooting him in place. The cultist chanting reached a crescendo, their leader stepping forward to raise a jagged blade. Its surface glinted with an unnatural light.
There we go.
The air seemed to hum with malevolence.
He's being invited.
The knife fell, plunging into the chest of a bound victim. Blood gushed forth in a streaming torrent, and Gregor
So he ran into a sacrificial ritual.
Felt his knees weaken.
By the ruinous powers!
Cried the leader, their voice resonating with unnatural clarity.
Let this offering bridge the veil that we may drink deep of the warp's gifts.
Gregor stumbled backwards, the sound of his boots scuffing against the loose debris echoing in the square. Several hooded heads snapped in his direction, their eyes glinting like predatory animals. He fled, heart pounding in his ears, the scene burned into his mind. His flight was frantic and directionless, his only thought to escape. By the time he reached his hab unit, his limbs were shaking uncontrollably. He bolted the door and slumped against it, his chest heaving. The memory of the chanting and the grotesque effigy haunted him, even as he collapsed into a restless slumber. The following morning, the air in the hive seemed denser, heavier, with an indefinable tension. Gregor...
What's worse than running into a cult after a hard day's labor?
Trudged to the administratum vaults as usual, his thoughts consumed by the memory of the cultists and their grotesque ritual. The sight of their makeshift idol and the sound of the guttural chanting clung to him like a sickness. The whispers that rippled through the worker queues only deepened his unease. Unsubstantiated rumors flitted between clerks and sanitation workers alike. Tales of entire hab blocks found abandoned, RBT's enforcers vanishing without a trace, and strange symbols carved into the ferrocrete walls of the Underhive. Gregor kept his head down, unwilling to engage. Yet the rumors followed him even into the data vaults.
What rumors?
The clerks around him seemed jittery, their quills trembling as they wrote. The cogitators, usually a comforting drone of familiarity, hissed and clanked discordantly. He could almost feel the hive shifting beneath him, a wounded beast stirring uneasily in its sleep. The day crawled by.
I mean, he's screwed, right? He's got the taint of heresy.
Each hour a slow march toward an inevitable end. When the lumen globes dimmed to signify the close of his shift, Gregor felt no relief. Instead, he hesitated, his belongings clutched in his hands as he lingered at his station. Should he report what he had seen? The thought had gnawed at him all day, yet he knew the folly of speaking to.
The worst thing that can happen if something like that in this particular universe is to report what you've seen, because they're going to kill you, they're going to burn you along with the whole thing.
Freely in Territus Primus, those who drew attention of authority seldom fared well. The ecclesiarchy taught that ignorance was its own form of devotion. Perhaps it was best.
I mean, that was the lesson from that HBO series. The one where they had the nuclear meltdown in Ukraine. Everyone was so busy pointing fingers at whose fault it happened that, they were more afraid of actually obtaining the ire of the Kremlin instead of just, trying to solve the problem. That's why it took so long.
To embrace such wisdom now. But as he left the vaults and began the long trek home, his thoughts betrayed him. The route through Hab District 43 loomed ahead, a spectre of the previous night. His feet dragged, each step reluctant, yet he found himself tracing the same path once more. When he reached the derelict square, it was empty. The shattered Aquila stood silent, its jagged edges catching the faint lumen strips of the hive. There was no sign of the cultists or their foul effigy. Only a faint, coppery tang lingered in the air, and the ground bore dark stains that no amount of grime could fully obscure. Gregor stared at the space where the idol had stood, a strange hollowness growing in his chest. For all of his dread, some part of him had expected, perhaps even hoped, to find them again.
Really love this artwork. Look.
Instead, he was left alone with his memories and his fear. As he turned to leave, a sound froze him in place.
Like oil and pasto.
A faint scrape of metal against stone coming from the shadows of an alley. He strained his eyes but saw nothing. Still, the sound lingered, a low, intermittent scraping like a blade being sharpened. Heart pounding, he fled. The twisting alleys seemed narrower than before, the walls closing in as he stumbled through. When he finally reached his Hab unit, he slammed the door shut and bolted it, his chest heaving. He collapsed onto the narrow cot, staring at the stained ceiling as the Hive's unceasing din filled his ears. Sleep came only in fragments, and when it did, it brought nightmares of chanting voices and many-eyed beasts.
Of course.
By the time the klaxon blared to summon him to work, Gregor felt as though a year had passed in a single night. Yet he rose, dressed, and trudged out once more. In the Hive there was no place for despair, only the grind of duty.
Funny how the monotony is part of the entire thing. How it's part of the entire horror.
And the inevitability of suffering. The Hive's machinery ground on, and Gregor Tallow drifted through his days as if submerged in the murk of a polluted sump. The events of that night in Hab District 43 haunted him, their weight pressing down like a grav plate on his soul. Yet the Hive offered no reprieve, no quiet moments in which a man could gather his thoughts. Its ceaseless cacophony drowned his fears in a dull roar, yet also gave them space to fester, unnoticed, like a spreading rust beneath layers of grime. Weeks passed in a haze of repetition. The Administratum vaults became a refuge of sorts, their stifling monotony a reprieve from the disquiet outside. Rumours continued to swirl, darker now.
Rumors
Yet
of
Gregor
what?
buried himself in the safety of routine. The cultists had vanished without a trace, leaving no evidence of their ritual save for the stains in the square. It was as if they had been swallowed whole by the Hive's endless hunger. But then, the questions began. It started innocuously enough. A fellow clerk, a stout man named Bors, leaned across their shared cogitator station one day and muttered in hushed tones.
You've been hearing the stories, Tallow. Our BTs are questioning folk. Whole families disappeared.
Exactly.
Gregor kept his eyes
That's
fixed
bad.
on the parchment before him. Rumours. Always rumours.
Not this time.
Bors insisted, his voice trembling.
I saw them with me.
If people are disappearing and you have first-hand accounts from witnesses, they're no longer witnesses. They're no longer rumors. Because you're getting a first-hand account from witnesses.
Own eyes. 3 RBDs dragging old Mother Fent and her lads out of 17B. And they were screaming something fierce.
Gregor's quill hesitated, then resumed its measured strokes.
What of it? Likely tithe evasion or heretical text, not our concern.
But it was his concern,
Heresy.
wasn't it? He could still hear the chanting in his dreams, still see the jagged effigy in the flickering light. He dismissed Bors with a curt wave, but the man's words stayed with him long after the shift ended. By the time Gregor reached his Hab unit that evening, the tension in the air was palpable.
Alright, so the government's dragging people out, so rumors are no longer rumors.
Streets seemed emptier, the usual throngs of workers replaced by weary glances from doorways and alleys. Even the lumen strips cast a dimmer glow, as though the Hive itself was holding its breath. The next morning, the Hive awoke to the arrival of an Inquisitor.
There we go!
Gregor
Now
heard it
there's
first
bad
in the
news.
chittering whispers of the queue outside the vaults. The name hung in the air like a storm cloud. Inquisition. He did not know who spoke it first, only that its reverberation carried through the...
I mean, did someone snitch? How did they found out? How did the Inquisition find out about the cult? But then again, if you're sacrificing people, if you're grabbing people off of the streets, rumors are going to start swirling around. I guess that's how the Inquisition found out.
the masses with a power no voxcaster could replicate. Workers muttered furtively as they shuffled
They're all
towards their
dead.
stations, heads bowed, eyes flickering with a mix of
They're all dead if the Inquisition gets his sniff that everyone has knowledge or some semblance of knowledge. They might all be dead.
awe and terror. In the vaults, the news took on a sharper edge.
They say it's Ordo Hereticus.
Whispered Bors, pale as parchment.
You know what that means, don't you?
No, we don't know what that
Cults.
means.
Gregor felt his stomach lurch, but kept his expression neutral.
Idle talk. The Hive's rife with baseless fears.
Baseless? What about Hab District 43?
Bors pressed, lowering his voice to a hiss.
It's no longer baseless since he's like providing first-hand account of the horrors.
They've cordoned it off. Our BD's swarming the place. Word is, they found something down there. Something blasphemous.
Gregor's
Blasphemous.
quills snapped in his hand, the sound startling them both.
Enough!
He said sharply,
You'll bring
Enough.
the attention of the enforcers.
but he could feel it now, an invisible noose tightening around the Hive. The Inquisition's presence was not merely a rumor, it was a fact, and the Hive responded like a beast
Now a
cornered by
fact.
hunters. That evening, Gregor returned home with a growing sense of unease. He bolted the door as usual, yet the flimsy metal felt less secure than before.
Of course.
The shadows in his unit seemed to deepen as he sat at his rickety table, picking at a bowl of synth gruel with little appetite.
Yeah,
A
there they
knock
are.
shattered the fragile silence. He froze, spoon hovering midair. No one knocked in the Hive without reason, and rarely was that reason good. For a moment, he considered pretending he wasn't home, but the knock came again, louder this
Not
time,
worth it, man.
insistent.
Just end it now.
With
Resign
trembling
from
hands,
life.
Gregor unbolted the door. On the threshold stood a
I
man.
mean, death in the hands of the Inquisitor will not be slow. Or I'm sorry, it will not be quick. It will definitely be slow. It will definitely be painful.
Clad in the unmistakable
There we
regalia
go.
of the Arbites. His helmet bore the stark visored glare of justice incarnate, and his chest plate was adorned with a small
Your death
silver
will not be
aquila.
quick, man.
Gregor Tallow.
The enforcer demanded, his voice cold and
Just run for it. Resist. Get shot in the back or something.
mechanical through the vox grill.
Yes?
Gregor croaked, his throat dry.
How did they know
You
that
are
he
to
witnessed
report
something?
to Administratum Subsector 19 at 0300 hours tomorrow.
Why?
Do not deviate. Do not delay.
Before Gregor could muster a reply,
1900 at
the
7
Arbites
o'clock?
turned and disappeared into the gloom. The door closed with a metallic clang, and Gregor slumped against
Wait.
it, his heart pounding.
Wait, that's sort of a good news since they're just requiring him to show up for interrogation, so they don't suspect anything yet. They're just going to be interviewing everyone.
The summons hung over him like a death sentence.
It probably was
The
in this
corridors
particular
of
world.
Subsector 19 were unfamiliar. Their vaulted ceilings adorned with faded murals of imperial saints and victory scenes, long obscured by the soot of countless ages. Gregor followed a pair of Arbites escorts, their booted steps echoing ominously in the cavernous halls.
Booted
He had
steps
barely
echoing
slept, his
ominously.
mind racing with possibilities. Was this about the cultists?
It
Had
probably
someone
is.
seen him that night? Or was it simply another absurdity of Hive life? An arbitrary summons
All-
to answer for some minor
All of the
clerical
above.
error? They brought him to a chamber deep within the sector,
Oh.
its walls lined with towering shelves of dusty tomes and cogitator banks. The light was dim, casting a
Jesus.
sickly pallor over the Arbites who flanked him. At the center of the room, a tall, gaunt figure awaited. A man draped in dark robes that bore the sigils of the Inquisition.
There we go.
Gregor's breath caught. This was no mere Arbites commander. The man's presence radiated authority, a cold, unyielding force that seemed to press against
Is that an
Gregor's very
Inquisitor?
soul. His eyes were piercing, like twin blades that cut through all pretense.
Of course.
You are Gregor Tallow.
The Inquisitor said.
Hi.
It was not a question.
Yes, my lord.
Gregor stammered, bowing his head. The Inquisitor stepped closer, his boots clicking softly against the stone floor.
You frequent Hab District 43, do you not?
Gregor hesitated, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the Arbites' visors on him, their fingers no doubt hovering near their weapons.
Yeah.
Yes, my lord. My route home passes through it. And did you see anything unusual
Deny,
in that
defend,
district in the
depose.
past month?
The Inquisitor's tone was measured, but there was an edge to it, like the whisper of a drawn
Deny
blade.
everything.
Gregor's throat went dry. Images of the cultists flashed in his mind, their chanting, the blood, the effigy. But to admit
He's
to such
tainted.
knowledge was to invite suspicion, perhaps execution.
No, my lord.
He said
He wants to
carefully.
live.
I saw nothing unusual.
The Inquisitor's gaze lingered on him for a moment that stretched into
I remember that viral clip from that show. Like, are we the baddies? We have skulls on our uniforms or on our caps. I guess the main distinction if you're the baddies or if you're going to present someone as evil, especially if the skull's part of the uniform, is that if that particular unit or if that particular soldier will be dealing with civilians. Because if you're just going to be dealing with opposing forces, the skull's fine. But in this case, the skulls are literally dealing with civilians, so definitely part of the bad guys, or will definitely not be considered as a good guy.
eternity. Then he nodded, as if satisfied.
Very well. You will remain available for further questioning. Should
Don't
you
deep
recall
down.
anything at all, you will report to the nearest Arbites precinct. Is that clear?
Yes,
Clear.
my lord. With a flick of his hand, the Inquisitor dismissed him. The Arbites escorted Gregor back to the sector entrance, their silence more oppressive than any words. By the time he returned to his hab unit, he felt hollowed out, as though the Inquisitor had stripped away some essential part of him.
It probably
Sleep
did.
was a distant memory. The shadows seemed deeper now. The Hive's hum, a dirge that echoed in his mind. And still, the spectre of Hab District 43 loomed over him, a harbinger of the darkness to come. The days that followed Gregor Tallow's interrogation were a blur of dread and paranoia.
It
The
probably
Inquisitor's
is.
questions lingered in his mind, clawing at his thoughts like unseen talons. Every shadow in the Hive seemed alive with scrutiny, every murmur in the vaults a veiled accusation. He carried himself with a hunched posture now, as if bowing under a weight he could not name. Rumors continued to swirl through Territus Primus.
Our man
The
wants to
Arbites
live.
were conducting sweeping raids, pulling suspected heretics and cult sympathizers from their homes. Entire hab blocks were sealed off, their occupants
Of course.
either vanishing entirely or reappearing as corpses
Yeah.
dumped unceremoniously in the Underhive. Gregor heard whispers of greater horrors, bloodstains that could not be scrubbed
Greater
clean,
horrors.
strange symbols burned
Everyone's living under an inquisition, so things can always get worse. Thank you for watching, guys. Now, if you want me to check out other stories here on YouTube, please let me know in the comments. We upload every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard. Please like, share, subscribe, do the whole notification button thing to help me out with the algo. And don't forget to check out our Twitch channel where you can catch me do this live. Now, class dismissed.